Hi everyone, I'm CS Punshi, Indirect Tax Expert at Clear Tax, and today we all gathered here to understand about the GST disclosure in Tax Audit report. But before we even start our today's session, I just want to check if you all are able to hear me or not. So if you are able to hear me, just say hi on the chat box. Great. So it seems like everyone is able to hear me. So with this, we'll just start our today's session, which is on analysis of GST disclosure in Tax Audit report. And we are mainly going to focus on clause 44. We all know that there are certain information we need to fill in clause 44 of tax audit, which is 3CT, in respect of GST transactions, right? So there are a lot of things where we don't understand that what exactly we have to populate over there, how exactly we are going to prepare there. So we are going to discuss all this information in today's session. So we'll talk about the applicability of clause 44. We'll talk about the overview of information which we need to furnish in 3CT clause 44. Then we'll also understand about what exactly we mean by total expenditure over there. Then we'll talk about the revenue or especially the capital expenditure, whether we have to disclose that over there or not. We'll talk about certain inclusion and exclusion from the reporting. We'll also talk about the reporting of provisions and accrued expenses. And then we'll talk about the line item details of PL accounts, whether that has to be reported in our clause 44 or not. So we're going to discuss about all of this thing in detail in today's session. So let's start our today's session. So the first and the foremost thing, because when we are referring to this clause 44, right, the important point is that if we are talking about clause 44, which we know it is one of the clauses of form 3CT, which is a tax audit report, the question is when exactly we have to start reporting this information. So if we talk about that, so there they have clearly mentioned all the form 3CD, which has been issued after 31st March 2022. In that 3CD form, we are required to furnish all this information. So it's not very, I would say, the particular financial year. So it's all about, which means if we talk about FY 21-22, right? So for FY 21-22, the tax audit report will always be furnished after that only, right? Which will be always furnished after 31st March 2022. So if it is going to furnish after 31st March 2022, which means this 3CT form, especially the clause 44, we have to furnish that information while we file the tax audit report for FY 21-22. Right. Similarly, if we talk about 22-23, obviously that we are going to file in this current year, which is FY 23, right? So there we have to furnish this information in our 3CT report. So we have to mandatory report this information in clause 44. Now question is, what about my previous year? Whether this was even applicable for FY 2021? The answer over here is because 2021, I'm assuming the tax audit would have happened before 31st March 2022 itself, then we don't have to furnish the information of clause 44 of 3CTB. But if you are filing or preparing the tax audit report now because there was a delay, there has a lot of problems over there, in that particular case you have to furnish this information in that particular for that particular financial year. So this was about more of an applicability from which financial year, right? So they are just simply saying whatever the 3CD form which has been issued after 31st March 2022, there we have to furnish the information in clause 44. So it means this has become mandatory. Now it's no more optional. So when we look into this clause 44, we will understand that, okay, they are asking something about the breakup of total expenditure. Then they're asking about, okay, out of that breakup, you first tell me what is the total expenditure. Then tell me the supplies, the inward supplies in respect of from the registered person, then from the unregistered person. Under the registered also, they have done some breakdown, which means what is the exempt supplies or the nil dated supplies, what are something which is from composition dealer, right? So these are kind of information which has been asked in clause 44. We'll anyhow go in deep, like we'll actually understand what exactly they're asking for, how exactly we have to even prepare that. But when we are looking into this, we'll actually understand that this sort of information we have also reported somewhere else, right? And when we are just looking into that, then obviously our GST 9C form that hits into picture. Then we remember, okay, there is something called table 14 in 9C. And there, if you just see, the government also asks for total expenditures details over there. They ask, okay, tell me the purchases, tell me the freight. So they are asking some breakdown information and the corresponding values over there, right? The question is there a linkage between these two? Today, I will say there is, but not like completely. There's just some sort of linkage over there, but not completely. And we'll actually know why it's not a complete linkage over there. But then the next important point is that, okay, there is something related to expenditure in table 14 of 9C. But here, if we just look into this, when it comes to clause 44, or when we just talk about form 3D in itself, this is under income tax. 9C is under GST. Now, when we talk about filing GST and 9C, well, we all understand that this 9C form, when we file, this is always at a GSTN level. If let's say I have total 10 GSTNs, right? I'm going to file this 9C for 10 GSTNs, which means my 10 9C has to be filed. Every 9C will be at a GSTN level. I'm going to bring my turnover to a particular point. We're going to bring the ITC to a particular point, and then we are going to file 9C. So that is always at a GSTN level. But the question is, when we just talk about this, when we talk about 3CD form itself, which is one of the form under the income tax, which is a tax audit of income tax, question is whether this is also at a GST level or this is at a PAN level. So that's the first question. Maybe you all can answer whether this is at a PAN level or this is at a GST level. Maybe you can reply on the chat box. So when it comes to clause 44 of income tax, which is 3CD, question is whether this is at a GSTN level or maybe at a PAN level. I could see the answer from Nikita. Nikita says PAN level. Abhinav says PAN level. Roshni says PAN level. Mayuri says PAN level. Shiva. So everyone is saying PAN level, and that's the right answer, right? So obviously, when it comes to clause 44, this is always at a PAN level, which means I don't have to worry about the GSTN, right? I'm not going to look at a GSTN level and then I may say, okay, I have to give all the breakup of GSTNs, right? So that's not even required. This is always at a PAN level. Now, when I was talking about this, why even I asked this question? Because there is a need of this question, right? When I'm asking this question, there is a next question which I'm going to ask, and maybe you all can answer me that. We all understand when I supply from my one GSTN to the another GSTN, right? When I'm supplying from my one GSTN to the another GSTN, it will be sale for my first GSTN and this will be purchased for my second GSTN. That's true. When I'm saying it's a purchase, a kind of an expenditure, right? There's a sale for one GSTN and there's a purchase for another GSTN, which means a kind of a purchase or it's a kind of an expenditure for my other GSTN. My question is, do I have to report that information in my clause 44 or not? There's a sale for one GSTN, but there's a purchase for the another GSTN. Question is whether I have to report that expenditure which happened in my second GSTN while I'm showing this information in clause 44 of form 3CD. I could see the answer from Shrujna says no, Nilesh says no, Yashpal says no, Mayu says no, Purnima says no, Ganesh says no. I think most of you, everyone is saying actually no, right? And this is a correct answer. Why? Why we don't even have to show? See, it's a very simple thing because we are anyhow going to report this at a PAN level. So this is going to set up. If there's something sale for one person, then obviously there is a purchase for the other thing. And it's actually not even expenditure, but this is a kind of a supply which has been treated in terms of GST. It's a kind of netting it off, right? So we don't even have to report this information while we are filling clause 44. And you all have already correctly answered. Now, when we were just talking about this, now let me ask you another question. See, if we talk about clause 44, and till now I have not even discussed about what all information we have to furnish in clause 44, right? We have not even gone in details, but we know this is something in relation to total expenditure. So we have to report something in relation to my expenditure, which is my purchase side, which is something which is related to inward supply. We'll talk about all of this thing. Is it inward supply or is it total expenditure? Is purchase? What exactly is that? What all information we have to even furnish when it comes to clause 44? But before that, the another question is it like that this clause 44 is dependent on whether me as an SSC is registered or not registered? Maybe you all can answer whether reporting the information in clause 44 is dependent on whether me as a person, as an SSE, is registered under GST or is not registered under GST. I could see answer from Sujana who says no, Yashpal says no, Purnima says no, Sachin says no, Avnish, Abhinav, Dipesh, everyone saying no, right? So I think you all have correctly answered. So which means you clearly understand this clause 44 is not dependent on whether I am registered under GST or I am not registered under GST. And why? Why it is not even dependent on that? This is a very simple thing. They are talking about expenditure. They're not talking about sales part over here, right? When they're talking about the expenditure, in that particular case, irrespective of whether I'm registered under GST or not unregistered under GST, I may always purchase something from either a registered person or maybe from an unregistered person. So here it does not, it actually, we don't have to care about whether I'm registered under GST or I'm not registered under GST, right? That's a important point. So, which means even if I'm a doctor, I'm availing some services, I don't have to register under GST because let's say my all the services which I am provided is exempted under GST. So, if all the services which I am providing is exempted under GST, in that particular case, we all know that we don't have to get registered under GST. So, this person is not registered under GST, but assuming this tax audit is applicable to this person. So, to this doctor, this tax audit is applicable. In that particular case, this clause 44 has to be the clause 44 has to be filled in by the auditor over here, right? So this was the another important point which we have to understand. So we don't have to worry about that whether the audit is registered under GST or not. We have to still report this information in clause 44 of form 3CD. So when we were talking about all this thing, the question is what exactly we have to even report it over here, right? So let's go with the wording which was there over in this particular or in this particular clause. So here it's a breakup of the total expenditure of entities registered or not registered under GST. So they have clarified it. We don't care about whether they are registered or they are not registered. It's just a breakup of the total expenditure. But again, we have to remember because there's another, I think, confusion which we always have. When we read this word breakup, we always say, oh, are they talking about that we have all that breakup which we used to show in Form 9C? Is this something in relation to that? Okay, there was some breakup like purchase, there's some breakup like fuel, there was some breakup like the expenses and all. They were asking for some capital expenditure and all. Do we have to show such breakup over here when it comes to the clause 44? That's like another query or the another questions which we have in our mind. So see, one another part which we should be very clear is that they're not asking about the breakup in that way. What breakup they are talking about, that see your total expenditure whatever you have to show in a breakup which we have shown over here in this columns, which means they're clearly saying that when I'm talking about the breakup over here, I just want to understand this total expenditure, whatever the expenditure you have, this expenditure was in respect of the purchases from maybe a registered person, the purchases from the unregistered person, under even if it is purchases or the expenditure from the registered person, what was in relation to the exempt supplies, what was the purchases which was done from the composition person, what was other than that. That is what they're even asking for, right? So here we don't have to show the breakup like what was total purchase, what was my total freight, what was my maybe capital expenditure and all that breakups are not required here. What we require here is this breakup what we have shown in the screen. So this is like another important point which we should understand. So we don't have to worry about all that expenditures, but we are showing in even 9C, which right now is optional in nature. If we want to fill in that information, we can always go ahead and fill the information, but otherwise it's optional. So here, when we were showing, then you will be then again one thing when we look into the government utility also, right? The government utility give you an option to add plus plus plus, right? So we can keep on adding multiple rows over here. What is the need for that? Why do we have to even show that the multiple rows over here? Can't I just show the total expenditure as a one line item? Then the government should not even allow me to add multiple rows over there. Then what's the need there? See, when we just talk about this, the government is clearly saying that it's a total expenditure. You show me the breakdown and all. But see, many times we are anyhow maintaining our books of accounts at a branch level or maybe at a GST level. So it's always good that you can always provide this information maybe at a GST level, right? So you may provide so that even if you tomorrow have to match this information with your respective GSTs, you will be able to do that, right? Just for your reference purpose, you can provide that information at a GST level, but it's not compulsory. You can always consolidate it at a pan level and just report one row over here. That is what you can do that. But if you feel like, okay, I'm anyhow maintaining my books of account at a GST level, then you can always add this information for multiple GSTs, which means if you have 10 GSTs, you can add this information for 10 GST. But you may always say that, okay, I have 10 GST, but maybe there are two entities which is unregistered because I don't have any taxable supplies over there. In that particular case, you can even add the information separately as a separate row over here, right? Now, if we just talk about this, so one important point which we understood clearly was that, okay, here we are not talking about the breakup in the way it was related in 9C, right? That was the important point which we should understand. So they have not asked for such breakup. What they just want is tell me the total amount of expenditure which was incurred during the year. Now, the next important point. What exactly we mean by the expenditure over here? Maybe if you would like to try this out, you can reply on the chat box. What exactly we mean by the expenditure over here? Is it equivalent to, because if we just go in GST, we all understand there is no concept of expenditure. Under GST, they what exactly they mean is with the inward supply. So they always use the word inward supply, they never use the word expenditure over there, right? It's always the inward supply in GST. But here, when we look into the definition, we are saying it's the total amount of the expenditure incurred during the year. I could see, I think there is one, I think Srinivas saying it's a debit to PL account. Purnima says expenditure incurred. Nilesh says the expense which we have booked, and the base says expenditure should be reported in PL. I think, yes, so some of you have actually answered very well. But see, I will now try to explain maybe. So if you ask me, is it always a debit to the PL account only? I would say no, that's not the fact. Maybe why it's not only the debit to the PL account, because there can be certain things which you would have capitalized, like for example you would have purchased the capital goods, or maybe you have purchased fixed assets, right? So if you have purchased maybe the furniture, for example, for your office purpose, obviously you're not going to show that as a debit entry in your PL account, rather it will directly come into your balance sheet, right? So there can be certain capital expenditure will not be part of PL account, but yes, we have to show it over here because that's also our expenditure, right? That's one case. The second case could be that some entries like provisions and all, like we may have, let's say, provision for depreciation, maybe provision for bad debts. The question is whether that is an expenditure for me. If I just talk about depreciation, that's the one other example, and we always show the depreciation again in my PL account as a debit entry. Question is, do we have to even show, and whether that is even treated as an expenditure, right? I could see answer from Purnima says no, and Vishal says no, Abhinav says no, Nikita says no, and which is right, right? When we talk about the depreciation, for example, that is not even my expenditure, right? So which means I don't have to show it over here. So which means in short, we are saying, okay, we are going to look into the debit side of my PL account, yes, but we are not going to include the provisions entries over here, whether it's a provision for depreciation or it's a provisions for bad debt. All the provisions will not be included while we are reporting expenditure over here. But at the same time, we have also added the capital expenditure, like if we have purchased some fixed assets and all, that again has to be added over here. So if we are looking into this, we are saying, okay, it's an inward supplies, kind of. I'm just saying kind of right now the word, right? So now the next question. If we just go into the GST, right? Here GST have used the word inward supplies. Inward supplies may include certain nil dated supplies, it may include certain exempt supplies, it may even include some non taxable supplies. It may even have some informations where we maybe like there can be certain other information like taxable supplies and all. It could be import of goods, it could be import of services and all. All of these are kind of purchases. All of this thing, whatever I have mentioned right now, is inward supply. Now, question is, let me ask you, whether import of goods, and I think it's a very easy thing and there's nothing technical, a very generic question. Whether import of goods, is it my expenditure? if I've imported something from outside India, whether it's my expenditure. I could see Nilesh says yes, Dipesh says yes, Abhinav says yes, Sachin says yes, everyone is saying yes. It's a very simple thing. Yes, obviously, import of goods is my expenditure. What about import of services? If I have purchased some services from outside India, and I may have even paid the taxes under reverse charge, whether that's my expenditure. I could see answer from Sachin says yes, Keshav says yes, Dipesh, Nilesh, everyone is saying yes. And which is again the right answer, right? Import of services is also an expenditure, and I am paying the taxes. And there is a reason why I'm asking all this question. Maybe then you have to answer me while I'm going to put these entries in a different tables over here, right? You said import of goods is expenditure, and you're like, yes, that's the correct answer. If you say import of services is an expenditure, I will say, yes, that's also a correct answer. Yes, that's an expenditure. Then I asked you another question whether depreciation was an expenditure. You clearly mentioned no, depreciation is a provision, it's not expenditure. We are not going to report it over here. That's also a correct answer. Yes, obviously it's not. Then I asked, okay, what about the purchases? The normal purchases you have made in your businesses, are they expenditure? Let's say you have just purchased some goods and all. Are they expenditure? The answer is again yes, and everyone is saying yes. Jitendra, Ashu, Anuj, everyone saying yes, which is not normal, right answer, right? Now the next question is, then I asked, okay, let's say what you have purchased, you just have taken some services or maybe certain goods. Let's assume you purchased some medicines and there was no tax to be levied on that medicine. It was completely exempt. Whether that is a expenditure or not. I could say answer from Jitin, yes. Abhinav says yes. Mayur, Rohan, Hari Kumar, everyone saying yes. Yes, it's also an expenditure. You purchased some medicines which was exempt, and you say like, yes, it is an expenditure for me. That's right. It is an expenditure, right? And then I said, okay, when you're talking about all this thing, then I'm like, okay, let's assume that you had incurred some expenses for some employees' benefit. You incurred some expenditure for employees benefit where you cannot claim ITC at all. It is covered under section 17 subsection 5 of GST. Now my question is whether that's also an expenditure for you. Abhinav says yes, Sudeep says yes, Dipesh says yes, Gitanjali says yes, Nikita says yes, everyone is saying yes, this is an expenditure. And I will says yes, that's an expenditure. You avail some professional services from a CA, whether that's an expenditure for you. Abhinav says yes, Avinish says, Karan says, everyone is saying yes. And that's true, right? So here, why I was even asking this much question, you're like, oh, it's a normal thing, right? It is anyhow debiting into my PL accounts. This all are my expenditure. Why are you even asking this thing? So whether you have noticed that when I was talking about all this thing, in some cases I said that the supplier may have charged some charge. Let's say, okay, let me ask you one more question. You purchase something from a local shop and this was not even registered under GST. Let's say you just purchase some maybe some pastries and all for your employees. Now question is whether that was an expenditure for you or not. I could see answer from Avni, Ashu, everyone saying is yes. Bhavna says yes, Vishal says yes. So everyone is saying yes, right? That's an expenditure. We all agree, yes, that's an expenditure. So here you may have noticed when I was talking about all this thing, for some part I said that okay, you purchase maybe from some unregistered person, that person would not have charged GST at all, right? You purchase something from an unregistered person, that person would have not charged GST at all because he is not even registered under GST, so he's not going to charge any GST from you, right? There can be some purchases from the registered person, but the supplies may be covered under reverse charge. So, which means me as a recipient was liable to pay the taxes under the reverse charge. So, I have to pay or I have to charge some tax on top of that, right? That's the second category. Third category would be that I may have purchased something from outside India, which was my import of services, which means I had paid the taxes under the reverse charge on that services, which is import of services. So, which means there was some taxes which was charged. I purchased from unregistered person. That services in itself was maybe exempted, or maybe the goods whichever I purchased from that unregistered person itself was exempted, right? That could be the case, which means he has not charged any GST at all. That was one case. Maybe I purchases from that person, the goods maybe not, it will be taxable in general if I would have purchased from registered person, but since that person was unregistered, I don't have to pay any taxes to that person, right? Third case is I purchased some goods or the services that was liable to reverse charge, so I had to pay some taxes on top of that under the reverse charge. So I am not going to pay this to the actual supplier, but I will directly pay it to the government. I said I availed some services from outside India, which was again, obviously, here the party is unregistered. Still, I am going to pay the taxes, right? Question is, why I asked this question was the I said unregistered. So right now, first I focused on all the unregistered supply. It could be your import of services. It could be in relation to maybe your import of goods. And I'm saying import of goods. Obviously, I have done some purchase from outside India, and that person is not registered under GST at all. It's the import of goods, it's import of services. It was purchases from an unregistered person, which the supplies itself was exempt. Let's say I purchased something from unregistered person, supply was taxable, but since the person was not registered at all, I don't have to pay any taxes. There can be certain purchases from unregistered person, but I was liable to pay the taxes under the reverse charge, right? Whatever the nature may be, right? Whether it was exempt, it was nil dated, I have to pay taxes, I don't have to pay taxes, all of that expenditure we have to show under a category. Which table we have to show? So you can see there's a column number 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, where exactly we have to report all this transaction, all this information. I could see answer from Ashwini says 7, Roshni says 7, and which is the correct answer. So this is all my purchases from the unregistered person, and I have to report all this expenditure which I have incurred under table number 7, right? So that is what one important point which we have to understand. But then you are like, okay, which means we don't care whether I can claim ITC on that transaction or I can't claim ITC on that transaction, right? Which means when I was talking about all this thing, I said in certain cases I said that okay, here this transaction was covered under 17.5, and when I asked you this question whether it's an expenditure, you said yes, this is an expenditure, which means you are not looking into the eligibility of the ITC, whether I can claim ITC or I can't claim ITC. You don't care about that. For you, that's an expenditure, which means we are going to report it over here, right? That was correct. Now, question is, let me ask you one question. When I was talking about all of this supply from an unregistered person, and you clearly mentioned that all this information will go in table number or column number 7, which was right. Here, in certain transaction, I would have paid the taxes, and certain transaction I have not paid any taxes at all. For cases where I don't have to pay any taxes because it was either an exempt supplies or an unrelated supply, or maybe the supplier was unregistered, so we don't have to pay any taxes. There was second category where I would have paid the taxes under reverse charge, or I would have paid the tax at ice gate. Question is, because all this expenditure I'm going to show in table number 7, question is, what about the tax amount? There was also a GST component, right? In many cases, like for example, import of services or whatever was covered under the reverse charge. What about the taxes? Do I have to show or include the tax amount also while I'm reporting this expenditure in my table number 7? I could see answer from Purnima who says we have claimed ITC. Avni says no. Purnima says no. Avni Karan says no. Roshni says no. Ashu says no. Okay. So most of you are saying no. We don't have to show that. So I think Avni says tax is not an expenditure. Right. So see, if you ask me this question, right, I will say that you have to, here we have to check the transaction. If you can claim the ITC, for example, you paid some taxes on the import of services, for example, right? And let's assume, obviously, I am also allowed to take the ITC on that. If you can claim the ITC, then obviously it's not my expenditure at all, right? Because I have claimed that ITC. In that particular case, I'm not going to show that information in table number 7. But the cases where I cannot claim ITC, that becomes cost for me, right? In such case, that becomes cost for me, and whenever it is becoming cost for me, I have to include that information in my table number 7. So this is something we have to understand, that can I go ahead and claim the ITC or I cannot claim the ITC. If I can claim the ITC, I don't have to show and report that information in table number 7. But where I cannot claim ITC because it was covered under 17.5, or I was not able to fulfill some of the condition, in that particular case I have to add that, because then in that case that has become my expenditure. It becomes the cost to the company, and I have to add that information over here, right? So this is one important point which we should understand. Now the another part. Okay, we understood all about the unregistered person. Then they said that okay, because we when we were looking into that, the first thing which we understood in table number 2, we said it is the total amount of expenditure incurred during the year. And as you all said, rightly reported, all my expenditure which is going to form part of my PL account, which is my debit side, minus all the provisions plus the depreciations entries, or sorry, not the depreciation, plus the capital expenditure and all, will form part of my column number 2. And we all agree. My next question to all of you is, there is a concept of inward supply. We all understand there is a concept of supply over here. There is something which is not considered as a supply as per GST. What is that? If we look into that, what is not considered as a supply, that are there are the cases like, for example, salary. If we pay salary to our employees, that is not considered as a I will say that is not considered as a supply, right? So it's not my supply. Now question is, if I'm talking about the salary part, because they are just saying okay, I'm going to pay salary, first question is whether that's my expenditure. It is covered under schedule 3, right? So it's covered under schedule 3 when I'm paying the salary. My question to all of you, whether that's my expenditure or not. Purnima says salary will not come. Minu says yes, it's my expenditure. What about others? So Deep says yes. Sachin says yes. Nikita says yes. Okay. So most of you are saying that yes, it is my expenditure. So if you ask me, yes, that's my expenditure. Salary is obviously my expenses, right? It's the cost to the company. But question is, when it comes to the salary, if that's my expenditure, but that's not my inward supply, it is covered under schedule 3. The question is, do I have to report that information in clause 44 or not? I could see Purnima says no, Nikita says no. So here, if you ask me, there are two views to it. The one view is that you don't even show all this information which forms part of schedule 3, right? Whatever forms part of your schedule 3, which means not even a supply, in that particular case, don't report that information in table number or column number 2 itself. So you don't show that. That's the one way of reporting that ignore all the transaction. That's one way. Or the second way is that you include that information in your 2, which is the I would say the column number 2. But at the same time, when you're including that, when it comes to the breakdown, it will never match with what is there in table number 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 7. It will not match with that. So there are two ways. Either you include that in 2, but when it comes to the breakdown which you show, it will not form part of your table, the column number 4 or column number 5 or column number 7, it will not form part of that. That's one way. Or second is you don't include at all. So when you don't include, anyhow it will not form part of the breakdown. So that's the two views, and you can follow any one. So when the another check which government is going to do is, they will always check that the expenditure which you have shown in like the column number 2, right, they will try to match that with what you have shown in 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 7. This should always match. If it is not matching, then they will ask why it is not going to match. And the reason why it will not match, if you have added this no supply transaction which was covered in schedule 3 in row, or I will say in the column number 2, right? So there would be a discrepancy in this particular case, and this is something both the are valid. There's nothing wrong in that. Either you can go ahead and include that, or you may actually exclude that from the main table itself. So these are the two views, and you can follow any one of this. Now, when we were talking about this, so we just understood that when it comes to schedule 3, ideally you should not include, you should just leave it. But it's not like you cannot, you can include that, and then you can always write that as a part of disclosure. So, right, when you write notes to that, you may always give the disclaimer that, okay, that this is an expenditure which has been included over here, but since this forms part of schedule 3, we have not added this as a part of column number 7, right? So you may always write that. Now, when we were talking about that, so we just talked about the total expenditure which was incurred. Now we have to give the breakdown, right? We talked about this is my total expenditure. Now we say out of this total expenditure, this was the total expenditure in respect of the purchases I have done or I have made from the registered person, right? So I may always do certain purchases from the registered person. So when I have done or I purchased something or I have done some expenditure and this purchases has been done from the registered person, there also I have to further give a breakdown. And what is that breakdown? That out of this, what were the purchases you have made which was exempted or which was kind of a nil rated, right? So what they're saying, tell me the total expenditure in respect of the entities which is registered under GST, which is relating to the goods or services exempt from GST. It could be goods or it could be exempt services which are exempt. Question is what we mean by exempt, right? So if you ask me the exempt definition itself, right? So it's not like the exempt definition. So exempt definition they have already defined. What do you mean by exempt supplies, right? And when it comes to exempt supply, they have clearly mentioned that exempt includes your nil rated and the non-taxable supplies also. Exempt includes your nil rated as well as your non-taxable supply. So both of these are actually included. So here they have defined. So nil rated supply and the exempt supply been defined even when you look into the notification number 1 and notification number 2 and notification number 11 and notification number 12. So when you look into these notifications, you will actually get the details whatever the supplies which are actually exempt under GST or covered under nil rated under GST, right? So that has already been defined. Then you will be like, okay, you also said that non-taxable supplies are also exempt or it is covered under definition of exempt. Question is, what is the non-taxable supplies? Maybe you can answer or you can try to answer what exactly we mean by non-taxable supplies under GST, which is actually included in the definition of exempts over here. I could see answer from Purnima. Purnima says petrol. So you are actually right, Purnima. So here when we talk about non-taxable supplies, right? So this is actually outside the GST purview, but at the same time, when it comes to this, the alcoholic liquor, right? Alcoholic liquor, the petroleum products, the five main things which we have covered under petrol, that is something which is considered as a non-taxable supplies. So that has to be over here. So if you are into the business of alcoholic liquor, all this petroleum product, the five petroleum products which they have mentioned, then that information also you have to report in column number 3, right? So if you are purchasing some exempt supplies and all, I gave an example. Let's say you purchase some medicines, right? Medicines was, let's say, exempt. There was no tax on top of that. You have to report that in column number 3 itself, right? There can be certain other purchases which you may have purchased, let's say, right? And let's say there was some agriculture produce, right? That again you have to show and report that information in column number 3. Similarly, if you have purchased liquor, it's a non-taxable supply that is also defined in the definition of this exempt supply because it also includes your non-taxable supplies. So that will also come in column number 3. Now, from the total expenditure, whatever the purchases you have made from the registered person, out you have removed all exempts or nil rated or non-taxable supplies and you have kept in, I would say, column number 3. Now, from that, now this is done. From the remaining supplies, you will say, okay, what were the purchases which you have done from the composition dealer? Obviously, this composition dealer is going to raise a bill of supply. There would be a GST mentioned, but there would be no tax amount which will be mentioned, right? So, in respect of all that supplies which you have done from the composition, which means no GST was charged by them, there was a bill of supply, but at the same time, there was a GST which was mentioned, that all supplies you have to show. So from that GST itself, you would know that this particular GST belongs to a composition dealer, and there that information you have to show in column number 4, right? So here you will get 3 and then you will get 4. Then remaining supplies, right? The difference of all the registered supply, you removed exempted composition. The remaining information will come in table number, or I would say the column number 5, right? Once we got 3, 4, 5, right? We have done 2 total expenditure, we understood. Then we have reported the exempt supply in 3. Then we have talked about composition supply and we reported in 4. Then we talk about all other information we have reported in 5. There was no problem. Now the next point is they said, okay, now in 6, you just tell me the total payments to a registered entity. When we are talking about total payment to the registered entity, question is, are they talking about payments now? Maybe I would have done payment. I may not have done some payments and all. I may have even paid certain advances to the people. What exactly are they even asking for this? That's like another question mark, right? So the one important point which we should again understand when they're talking about the payment, exactly that's not a payment over here. For them, it's a total expenditure to the registered entity, and it's nothing but it's just a sum of what you have reported in 3 plus 4 plus 5 that will actually form part of your 6. Even when you go and look into the government utility, right, today they auto compute that. And how they're going to auto compute that is just nothing but 3 plus 4 plus 5 that is equal to 6. So it's nothing, it's not actually the total payment, it's just a total expenditure which you have done when it comes to the purchases or the expenditure from the registered person, right? Whenever you have done the purchase from the registered person, that will come in your total, which is column number 6. So it's actually not a payment, it's just a sum of your 3 plus 4 plus 5, right? I could see there's a question from Jayesh who's asking, what about the land purchase, column 2 and 3, correct? So here, when you talk about the land purchases, right? Again, land purchase, when it comes to this, it is covered under Schedule 3, right? I'm assuming you're talking about that. So if it is covered under Schedule 3, in that particular case, as we told, right, that this information, you have two options. Either you don't report this at all. That's one way. Or if you're planning, no, I want to report it, then just report in 2, and there would always be difference between the expenditure which you have reported in 2 with what we have shown in 6 plus 7. So that is okay. You have to inform that information as a part of your disclosure, right? That is how you can always report this information. So when we now talk about 6, so 6 is very clearly, it's not a payment, it's just a total expenditure to the registered entity, and it's just a sum of 3 plus 4 plus 5. That is what we have to show in 6. Now going forward, then we are like, then the next part is 7, which is expenditure which is related to entity who are not registered. So if I have done certain purchases from the unregistered person who are not registered under GST, that has to be reported in 7, right? That is what we have to do. Now in general, what you have reported in 2 minus 6 will always be equal to 7. That should be the case, unless you choose that whatever was information as a part of Schedule 3 of your this GST, right? If you have added that also in 2, then there will be difference which will be equal to the amount which was coming in your Schedule 3, right? That's how you have to always do this while you're filling this table. And here we don't have to give the breakup of like what is purchase, what was freight, what was information, the other information which government ask in 9C. All the breakup is not required. You may choose that, okay, if you want to report this at a GST level, so you can add multiple rows over here, but that's again your choice. You can always feel free to just add a summary over here. You may always sum that up to a pan level and just report this information at a pan level. So here, when we were looking into all this expenditure, right? So in short, what we said, it's just a breakup of total expenditure of entity, whether you are registered or you're not registered, doesn't matter. But whatever breakup you are showing, you have to see, okay, this is purchased from registered person or this is purchased from the unregistered person. Now when we were looking into that, right, so when we were looking into that, as we explained, the question was, what about depreciation? Do we have to report that? The answer was no, we don't have to report depreciation, because it's just a provision entry and provisions should not be recorded when it comes to clause 44. Then the second point was, what about this schedule 3, right? There is a schedule 3 GST Act. Question is, should we even include that or should we not include? For example, there's a remuneration to the employee. That's the best example. The salary was the best example. So here we may always choose. So there's a choice over there. Though ideally, if you ask me, should we include? I would say you should not include that. You don't include that information at all when it comes to clause 44, but you may feel free to choose that. You can include that, but when it comes to breakdown, you don't even have to record that information. Then the next part was whether the capital expenditure will also form part of this. The answer is yes, even if it's not forming part of my PL account, which is debit side of my PL account. But since this is the information, this is my expenditure, I should report that information over here. So here, when we just look into the for example, the schedule 3, right? Even the supply of goods from a place in non-taxable, which is nothing but my high C says. So high C says is again part of schedule 3. So you can choose whether you want to even add that or you don't want to add that. Then the other important point is that there can be certain items which is in nature of allowances and all, right? For example, there's an HRA and there can be other informations we would have seen. Like, for example, you may talk about internet bills and all, right? So the question is, should that be even included or not? So if it is forming part of, because salary, right? Salary, if it is forming part of schedule 3, then you may choose if you want to add or not. That is how you can do that. But in general, it should be excluded when it comes to 3 to 7. So here, when we were looking into this, the another important point, and we all have already discussed that you don't have to give this as a nature wise. So we don't have to give the expenditure of a nature wise, whether it's my internet or it's conveyance and all. That is not even required. You can just always give a summary level information over there. And other than that, we just talked about exempt supplies. That when we talk about exempt supply, whether it includes non-taxable supply, as we said that in the definition of the exempt supply, it actually includes your nil-rated supply as well as your non-taxable supply. Both are included, so you have to report the information whether it's you have purchased the alcoholic liquor, or maybe you have purchased some petroleum crude, high speed diesel, motor spirit, or natural gas or aviation turbine fuel. All of these are actually including the non-taxable supplies and should be added over there, right? So if you look into the definition of exempt supplies, which is already defined in section 2 subsection 47, it actually consider your nil rated supplies, all exempted supply, and also it includes your non-taxable supplies. Then the question was about the high C sales, because it's covered under schedule. So let's see some of the item and maybe you can answer. So this is some of the items which are part of your PL account, and maybe you can tell me whether it will form part of clause 44 or not, and if yes, then where exactly we have to show that. First is high C sales. Should it be part of your clause 44 or not? So if we just talk about high C says, should we put that or not? I could say Abhinav says no, Purnima says two options, Karan says no. Okay. So as I told you, right, there are two options. You can even include it and you choose not to include that. So it's on you what exactly you want to do. The second part is remuneration to employees. Should that be included or not? So here also is two options. Either you can include it, but you don't have to show the breakdown, or you exclude it altogether. Then the third was petroleum crude, high speed diesel oil motors, etc. Motor spirits and all. Whether that should be included or not, I could see Purnima says in 3, yes, include that. Avni says non-taxable, and which is again the right answer. We should include that, right? Again, when we are saying it's non-taxable, another important point we should understand. You also have to look into it whether you have purchased from a registered person or unregistered person, right? Because most of the time you will see they're not even registered. If they are not registered, right, you again have to remember, if they're not registered, then you don't have to show the breakdown over there. Rather, you just have to include in the last, which is column number 7. If they are registered, in that particular case only you have to show that the column number 3. So this is something we should always keep in our mind. Then the next is electricity expenses. What about electricity expenses? Do we include that or not? I could see there's another question from Jayesh. What about the interest to bank? So Purnima says yes, we should include that in 3. And yes, because electricity expenses is a kind of exempt supplies and that has to be included. And answering to Jayesh, right, interest to bank is also my expenditure and it is an exempt supply. Purpose of reversal under 442, right? We don't have to consider that, but interest is also kind of my expense. At the same time, it is considered is like I don't have to pay GST on all. So yes, that has to be again included over there. And in some cases, interest is taxable, and in wherever it is taxable, you have to show under the taxable supplies. Now, the next point is the cash discounts or early payment. So, if you ask me about cash discounts and all, see, all cash discounts are actually reduced from purchase itself. So, you just have to show the net figure over there. That is how we have to show it. If you talk about inward return of goods sold, so there are cases, let's say, you would have sold something, then you got the goods back, right? Again, when you got the goods back, it's not inward supply, it was sales return. And whenever there is a sales return, you don't have to report this information when it comes to clause 44, right? Similarly, when it comes to interest to banks and NBFCs, and so if it's an exempt supplies, then we have to show it over here, depending on whether the lender was registered or not registered, right? Similarly, if you have interest paid to on loans to individual, then again it's an exempt supplies, and you have to report that information as a part of total expenditure as well as in the breakdown, depending on whether the supplier was registered or not. If it's registered, then maybe in the 3, 4, 5, there you have to show. Otherwise, you have to show in 7. Now, when it comes to foreign exchange loss is not a supply. So here you have two choice, whether you want to report that in the part of total expenditure and don't show the breakdown, or you may choose not to show that at all. You can just ignore that. It's similarly when it comes to ESI and EPF, that is also not a supply, so ideally we should not show that. And even if we talk about fee for trade license, which is greater than 5,000, so it's a kind of a taxable supplies, and you have to report in column number 7. If we talk about import of goods and services, as we discussed, when it comes to import of goods and the services, this is a supply from unregistered person, and you should report that as a part of column number 7, right? Now, in the same way, if you just look into the royalty payment to government, right? So when there's a royalty payment against a taxable supply, it has to be reported in column number 7. Right? Now the next part is about the if you talk about, see, we just talked about all this thing, right? We just talk about, okay, there is column number 2, there is column 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, right? So we just talk about all of this column. So when we were talking about all this column, the another important point which we should understand over here is we should have a sort of reconciliations between this table. When I'm saying about the reconciliation, so when you look into all that breakdown again, right? So in that breakdown, there was a total expenditure. I what you have reported here in 2 should always match with what you have reported in 6 plus 7. That is how it should work. Similarly, what you have reported in 6 should always match with what you have reported in 3 plus 4 plus 5. Right? This is how we have to report it. That's the ideal way. But obviously, if you go with that options, right, where schedule 3 information you want to report it over there, then there would be a mismatch in this too. Right? So this is two important points again remember while we are reporting the information in respect of these different tables or different terms of clause 44. Right? In the same way, so when we were looking into all this thing, the another important point which we were talking about was that, see, we reported this. Let's say I choose that, okay, I'm not going to report all the schedule 3 transaction in my total expenditure. That's okay. You should choose that you are not going to report, but only make sure that you are given a disclosure there, right? Similarly, many times you may say about the provisions or not. Should I report? Yes, you should always give a disclosures, right? You may always say in the auditor's note that yes, I have not included this or I have not considered this, so that even tomorrow the government says, okay, I could see this different figure which is coming over there, but whatever you have shown is little different. So you should be able to show that by the notes itself. Similarly, you may always, many times we have a lot of problem in respect of tax amount. Should we include or should we not include? So as we mentioned, if it's forming part of expenditure, you should add that. But if it is something where you are going to claim the ITC, you should not add that, right? You can give there as a part of your note itself, right? This is how you can always look into the different perspective when it comes to declaring the notes and all. Now when we were looking into all these things, so this was all about the clause when we are looking into the clause 44. So this is especially focusing on the GST side, right? Like how exactly this information has to be shown in clause 44. Now maybe if you have any queries, we'll just take all of your queries. I could see there is one query from who is asking if March 23 sales from one branch was recorded as purchase in April 23 in purchasing branch, then still no need to report the specific inter-unit sales netting off of yes. So Abhinav, in that case also I would say that, see, ideally it should be done in the same month itself, right? Ideally that should have been done while you would have done the inter-unit reconciliation. You should have reported that, but still if that does not happen, still you don't have to report that expenditure. Next is from FY 22-23 expense. ITC claimed in 3B of October 23. ITC claimed in 3B of October 23 after filing 3CD of 22-23 whether at GST amount. See, even if that ITC has been claimed at a later point, since this expenditure for a particular year, you should always. So I'm assuming this expenditure was recorded in FY 22-23 itself. So if this expenditure was recorded in 22-23 itself, that's a different thing that the when it comes to ITC, it has done at the later stage, or it was claimed afterwards. Still, you should go ahead and show there's a part of expenditure of 22-23. But frankly speaking, if you ask me, we always, right, when the auditor is doing all this tax audit reports and all, most of the time they will see if there's some pending at ITC, they will ask you to claim that ITC also. So hope Abhinav, I was able to answer your queries. If you have any other queries, you can feel free to ask me that too. Another question from Bishal who's asking, please repeat about exchange laws. Bishal, when it comes to the foreign exchange laws, right? That exchange laws is part of your Schedule 3, and there you can choose not to show that information at all when it comes to your total expenditure. Or you may choose to add that information, but you don't have to show that information as a part of your breakdown, right? That is what we have to see here. Another question is from Tarun, who is asking, what about prepaid expenses? Tarun, when it comes to the prepaid expenses, right, like, which means you have already paid that expenses in advances, right? If you have paid in that expenses in advance, again, I will say you should not report in the particular financial year. Should always show that information in the next financial year. Another is from, do we need to consider provision of expenses for this table? So whenever there is a provision of expenses, and which means there's a certainty, yes, let's say there's an internet bill, right? You will always write that on 31st March itself. You should always add that. But again, you remember that when it comes to this, there's a certainty. But if there's things like depreciation, bad debts and all that, you should not include that. I think there's another question from Abhinav who is asking, 3 City Auditor wrote SSC don't have data, so clause 44 was reported blank. Abhinav, ideally we should not do that, because this is a kind of a wrong practice if you're doing that. So ideally, we should report all this thing from the particular financial year when GCD started. Another question from Koteshwara, who is asking, what about the government payments such as tax expenses and all? So Koteshwara, if you talk about the government payments and all, right? So when it comes to the government payments, because if you are talking about the tax expenses and all, we have to check the nature, right? What exactly is the nature over here? So if it is something which is part of your kind of a Schedule 3, right? Most of the cases you will see it's a part of your Schedule 3 itself, then you don't even have to that as a part. You should not add that as a part of your total expenditure. That's how we have to look into this. Another question is from Nitesh, who's asking whether the column 3, 4, 5, 6 needs to be matched with what we has reported in 3B. No, Nitesh, that's not necessary that it has to be matched with what we have shown in 3B, because if you ask me, you cannot even match that. 3B may only show the IDC amount, you only show the tax amount. But when you look into this, you are actually showing the taxable value most of the time, right? Or the total invoice value. So that will never match, because 3 about the ITC amount. Okay, I think I have covered most of your query, and some of you have also asked for the PPT. So for PPT also, we can just share that. So anyhow, with the end of the session, right, you will be receiving the PPT. Still, in case you don't receive it, you can feel free to mail us at gstsupport@cleartext.in. That's our mail ID. Or you can even mail me at surbi@clear.in. So that's my mail ID. So you will definitely will share the PPT with you over the mail. Another question from Ashish, who's asking if inventory purchase need also to be reported in clause 44. So Ashish asked me, if you talk about purchases, right? Inventory purchase is also your kind of a purchase, a kind of a raw material purchases and all, right? You have to show that information over here as a part of total expenditure, because that's also your kind of purchase. So I think, hope I was able to answer your queries, but still in case I was not able to, or maybe the queries have been missed out, feel free to mail me at gstsupport@cleartext.in or at surbi@clear.in. That's my mail ID. So I will be happy to answer you over there. And in respect of PPT, you will anyhow be receiving this PPT after the end of the session. But still, if you don't receive, just mail us at gstsupport@cleartext.in. So that's our mail ID. With this, thank you. Thank you very much for joining the session.